joining us for the debut of In the Loop. We're talking tech and trends with GovLoop. I'm Emily Jarvis, and I'm the events manager here at GovLoop. And I'm joined by my colleague, John Monroe, who is our director of content. So you're probably asking, what in the world is In the Loop? Well, it's our new quarterly show where we break down what's happening across government. We're going to be talking about the stories that you actually need to know through the lens of technology, policy, and the workforce. Each episode is designed to spotlight key issues, explain why they matter, and unpack what government leaders are doing about them, all in quick, easy to digest segments, or so we hope. Today, we are diving into four big focus areas: agentic AI, cybersecurity in the age of AI, digital services, and state budgeting processes. But before we jump in, we do need to give a quick thank you to our sponsors, Okta, Ping Identity, Pluralsight, Carasoft, and Snowflake. We appreciate your support and making this show possible. And with that, John, let's get started. And we're going to start by talking about agentic AI. Why is there so much buzz about it?
All right, Emily. So, by the way, I just want to go on the record. I declare 2026 the year of agentic AI. Now, I'm not sure that's really going to be the case, but this is important because here's the thing. All right, so we know all about generative AI, right? I mean, we've all been using it, it's out there. And, Gen AI is great at handling tasks. It can draft emails, it can summarize documents and all that stuff. And that's really cool. But agentic, on the other hand, can automate processes from start to finish. That's number one. And number two, it can do this with minimal human supervision. So basically, you give an agent a goal and it can figure out how to get it done. So for example, agentic AI is expected to play a big role in cybersecurity. And there's a good reason for that, because agentic has the ability first to detect threats much more quickly than humans and then quarantine them. And it can do this at a speed that a human could never match. So it can take multiple steps and then say, hey, people, I stopped something here. And that's a big game changer.
Okay, I get where we are going in the art of the possible, but let's break it down to the art of what's happening right now. How does this affect Govies now and maybe in the future a little bit too?
So, I mean, what we're really looking at, according to the experts and including to a lot of govies, is the workforce is slowly but surely becoming kind of a hybrid workforce. You got human workers on the one hand, and then AI agents on the other. All right, so let's just take an example. So imagine that you need to produce a report on transportation choke points in a city. I don't know where that comes from, but let's just go with that. All right, so you have some data on that, let's say, but you need to get some more. So on the one hand, you could turn to a coworker and say, hey, could you go find some other data sources for this? Or you can ask an AI agent. It can go out, find data sources. Oh, then it could analyze that data, combine it with the data you have, and then it can produce a report, and it can produce that report, say, for an executive level audience. So those multiple steps from start to finish. That's pretty amazing.
All right. So, obstacles, right? Because we're not snapping our finger and this is all happening. We need money, we need resources, we need people who know how to make these things. What are the obstacles?
So, the first obstacle has nothing to do with money, nothing to do with people. It's that agentic AI can be a little scary. It can be a little scary. And here's why. So think about what I said before about, agents can act with, minimum supervision, that they can act autonomously. Well, that can be kind of creepy, but and I don't really mean it's scary as if agents are going to go rogue and it becomes Terminator. But what could happen, and what we've actually seen happen, is agencies given a goal, they figure out how to get a job done. Oh, there's these pesky security controls or privacy controls that get in the way. Well, these agents are pretty smart, so they can figure out how to bypass those controls. So that's a little scary. I say it, having AI agents is like having a really, really smart but reckless teenager. So that's one thing. But there's another one that's more kind of a wonky issue, and that's auditability. And that's easy for me to say, but auditability. Okay, so think about that report I mentioned earlier where the agents went out and gathered data, analyzed the data, produced the reports, and it gives you a recommendation, and then you say, hey, yeah, we're going to do this. Okay, then an auditor comes and knocks on your door, and they said, hey, that's really interesting what you do here. Can you walk me through how you arrived at this conclusion? And that's the part that government agencies are a little concerned about, because a lot of what happens with AI is sort of inside the black box. We don't really know how it's working. And so if there is an auditor, if there is an audit, you know, will the agencies be able to satisfy those requests?
Hmm.
And that's the real issue. And the thing is, it's not like this is impossible. It's not impossible, but there's work to be done.
All right. We're getting our helmets on and then we're going to bike down the path to agentic AI. That has been your primer on agentic AI. This segment has been brought to you by Okta.
The special something that Okta brings to the table is the ability to work with all of your technology. So not just your modern SaaS-based apps, but the mainframe app that you've got, the on-prem app. We pride ourselves in being vendor neutral. And we also, as a core principle, have customer first mindset. So that's what Okta brings to the table.
All right, Emily, let's talk about cyber. How can we not talk about cyber? There's so much going on, but what do you see going on now?
All right. So, cybersecurity is everyone's favorite, not favorite thing to talk about, right? They always say at Thanksgiving you should not talk about politics and religion. I feel like in the government space, cybersecurity is that topic. But you mentioned the AI of it all when it comes to cybersecurity. And at its most basic, cybersecurity in the era of AI is just going faster and faster and faster. And it's not just AI that's really raising the stakes in our current environment. We're also seeing real world threats too. After attacks are tied to pro Iranian hackers are targeting Lockheed Martin, and then those same actors are moving to federal agencies themselves. The bottom line is that the threat landscape, it's not getting easier. In fact, it's getting more sophisticated and more personal, right? Attacks are going to agencies or individuals rather than kind of these targets that were a bit more obscure. So the times are really changing.
I mean, it is very interesting because you think about, oh, in the not too distant past, where say the email of the FBI director got
Mm,
hacked.
hmm.
That was a very purposeful statement, where some hackers said, hey, personal target, let's go after it, let's make a statement. So for people in the GovLoop community, though, what does this mean to them? I mean, I get it with all the big headlines and the FBI director and whatever, but what about people in the GovLoop community?
I think the thing that folks need to think about is when you talk about the director of the FBI getting targeted, it's also you who could be targeted. If you think back a decade ago, OPM got hacked and all of the personnel data from government agencies was impacted. It's your data, it's your privacy, it's your ability to access government services on time on the constituent side, right? Like if the DMV goes down because they've been hacked or school systems have gone down in the past, those are systems and services that you can no longer really use. And so the challenge is that agencies aren't necessarily as prepared as they should be for some of these new AI cyber attacks. You've got staffing cuts at federal agencies like CISA. That's taking a toll not only on the work, but leadership has turned over as well. And all of that really adds up to a real gap at a time when the pressure is only increasing. And that said, There are some signs of maybe movement towards potentially getting some more cybersecurity butts in seats, as we like to say. And that's because the Office of Personnel Management is now really actively recruiting cybersecurity talent through their program called US Tech Force. Recruits would serve across federal agencies, taking 2-year terms with an initial goal to build out about 1,000 or so folks for a cohort. It's a small step, and I'm not going to try and pretend like this is a really monumental step forward, but it is a step towards rebuilding capabilities to kind of build up that cybersecurity gap that we've been talking about.
And also, yeah, you mentioned the AI, AI in the mix. I mean, what I think about when I hear that is, okay, the problem that government has had with cybersecurity is as the threat landscape has gotten, just more intense, the pay rate has gone up, and government has always had trouble keeping pace with, private sector. Okay, think about the gazillions that someone can earn in the private sector if they know a little AI. And it's like, that's got to be kind of tough to compete with for agencies.
Yeah. We're bringing all the joy and uplifting coverage on this cybersecurity story, but I do think there is a little bit going forward that we could be encouraged about. I don't know if you all remember, but a couple of years ago, there was a SolarWinds outbreak, and a bunch of different companies were impacted because they were using the technology in a whole bunch of different ways. And after that, there was a real consensus that folks in the private sector and in government agencies needed to work together. And I think that mindset is still existing. There is a focus on collaboration. There is a working group right now of 20 private sector companies that are working with the administration to support that tech force by offering training and mentoring programs. Some will even nominate their own employees to serve temporary stints in government leadership roles. Now, this isn't a cure, it isn't a fix, but I think the more opportunity that we can have to share best practices with the few and strong folks who are in government kind of doing the work is incredibly important. And I think if this model works, it could be an effective way to share cybersecurity expertise across the sector and help government agencies keep pace with this very rapidly changing threat environment.
And I think what we're seeing with AI is even more interesting
Mhm.
because we're now seeing high level meetings between, federal officials and Silicon Valley. At
Mhm.
the highest level, it's like suddenly they've both discovered, wow, they really need to work together. They really need each other. And so it'll be interesting to see if that continues to play out.
Everybody's getting invited to the party.
All right. So this segment was brought to you by Pluralsight.
We treat the organization as a whole, even though we're technology focused. You speak to any organization and they'll tell you, we're not this organization, we're technically an IT organization that does these other things. And I think that's true. And we treat it right from a soup to nuts basis. So we understand that, there needs to be broad-based training, especially for things like artificial intelligence, where we created our AI Academy recently, which allows people to get that workforce-wide learning and then allows you to narrow down and focus down more deeply as you go through. I think we've got tools like Skill IQ and Role IQ that allow you to understand where the skills are at within your organization and allow it to automatically generate content that fills skill gaps only. I think that's a really important thing, is helping people increase speed to skills.
All right, John, let's talk digital services. What's happening there?
All right, so here's the deal. In recent weeks, both the IRS and SSA have been talking about trying to get out of paper checks. They just don't want to issue those anymore. And this makes sense. If you think about it, processing and mailing paper checks takes more time and costs more money than doing it digitally. And it's not just that digital services are more cost effective, they actually provide better service. Isn't it fun when money just like magically appears in your bank account? I think so. But the problem is a lot of people haven't signed up for digital payments. In the IRS's case, they say the number is 1.5 million. Now, 1.5 million is like a small percentage of the overall population. It's pocket change, but that's still a lot of people.
It is. And I gotta say, so my dad hates when I tell this story, but I tell it all the time because my dad recently applied for his Social Security Administration benefits, and the man refuses to get an email address, just flat out refuses. And in order to get your benefits now through Social Security, you have to have an email. And so he went into the offices of the Social Security Administration, and the wonderful woman there set him up an email account so that he could get his services. And I think about this story because that is so much time, and that is a wonderful employee. And she did such amazing work. She went above and beyond. My dad still sends her cookies every month. But that's a chunk of time that could have been eliminated if he had taken that process on himself. So you can imagine if there are a lot fewer Dan Jarvises and a lot more folks who are investing in those digital services side, how much more time and energy can be applied in those cases?
Well, and here's the thing, Emily. I think if you go back, say, 10 years, there were enough people who didn't have an email, who didn't have automatic payment, that agencies just took it for granted. It's like, yeah, there's going to be a certain number of checks that we have to mail out.
Mhm.
Well, now when so many people are now signing up for digital payments, so many people have emails, and that number's getting smaller, it's like agencies are spending a lot of money supporting a smaller and smaller number of people. And that's sort of the tricky point. In 10 years, this probably won't be an issue. But right now, we're in that kind of awkward transition phase.
We're the awkward teenagers. All right. So tell me, why is this important? And I think you've already hinted at this quite a bit, but why invest right now in digital services?
Yeah, so I think, digital services is both sort of the present and the future. And it's like, because most people are getting digital services, or a huge chunk are getting digital services, agencies got to invest in that, but they just have to think about what about those people who aren't there yet. And I think, and again, there's no simple answer to that. They have to think about it. So in the case of the IRS, here's what they're doing. So A, they're trying to encourage everyone, please sign up for automatic payment. But if you don't do automatic payment, well, maybe you can get a prepaid debit card.
Mm.
Or if you have digital wallet on your phone, maybe you can get that. But they did say they're still going to grant some exemptions. But I think that's really the focus right now is what is that path forward that kind of gets us to the end of the road?
I think this is even more felt in some cases on the state and local level because they're the ones delivering a lot of these services, right? And so that investment in digital services, I think, is even more talked about in those circles. You have, NASIO's conference every year, and digital services has always lingered towards the top 10 of their priorities. It's now in the top three. And so I think you can just see that evolution that you talked about moving forward here. Thank you, John. All right, this segment was brought to you by Ping Identity.
Well, the first thing that Ping Identity is doing is we're staying on the right on the boundary of development for agents because we're watching that closely and we're putting technology solutions in place just as fast as we can to protect. The big thing is that we already have a lot of the stuff, a lot of the technology, a lot of the solutions in place to manage agents. One of the big things we do is a solution that we have called Ping Protect that can be put in place quickly that starts watching for those things like bot attacks, man-in-the-middle attacks, and identifies risk and allows you to go in and put in actions to block that risk that is not acceptable. And that's what, if you don't have something like that in place, that's where I'd go first. And that's what Ping Identity is really focused on is layering on, no matter what your IDP is, it's layering on solutions that are going to add that layer of reducing risk for your environment very quickly with a quick return on investment.
All right, Emily, break my heart. You know, I've been covering, state and local government for a long time. budgeting is always an issue, but it feels like it's now an issue more than it's ever been. What's going on here?
All right, so there is no such thing as a normal budget cycle. I think we see this on the federal level when you have shutdowns. On the state and local level, it's even more intense in terms of how transformative different years can be. If you look at, let's say, the last 5 years, you had a bunch of states lose a lot of funding at the beginning of COVID and then adjust to a major revenue surge as kind of some of the federal programs came in to create this historic levels of aid that they were giving to state and local entities. And now they're pulling those funds back, right? You add into that the workload for states hasn't gone down. And in fact, it's grown quite a bit because states are taking on the responsibility for things like disaster recovery and cybersecurity, which we've talked a lot about today, as the federal government is rethinking kind of its roles in some of these areas. And to add just one more difficulty into this mix, you may have heard that the federal government isn't quite balanced. Well, in the states, it's a requirement that you balance your budget. You actually have to have the funds to pay for it. So the states can't run a deficit to borrow their way out of a shortfall. So when the numbers don't add up, well, unfortunately, cuts are kind of inevitable.
Yeah, and I think one thing that maybe a lot of people don't appreciate about what happens at the state level and at the local level is they're running on thin margins in the best of days.
Yeah.
And so when you lose money or you take on new responsibility, it's like this isn't something you go, oh, let's go find some money to cover this. It doesn't work that way. I mean, it is like when there is a change in number somewhere, someone's going to pay. And that's tough. That's a tough environment to be in.
Yeah.
So what does this mean for govies? How does this affect the people who are, really kind of working in the trenches?
Well, I think you just honestly alluded to it. And I hate the phrase do more with less because first of all, government's been doing more with less forever. There's never been enough resources. But I think the daily reality for state government right now is that they're doing less with perhaps less. Federal dollars are the second largest revenue source for funding for states, and they usually make up about a third of revenue. Now, that depends on the state. Some states get more, some states get less, but roughly about a third of their revenue comes from the federal government. And in some cases, that funding has dropped by as much as a third. So layer that on top of a state workforce that's aging. They've got the limited resources that you were just talking about, and an ongoing struggle to attract new talent. And you can see that things are kind of spiraling a little bit. And the result is that a system that's usually under stress is now incredibly under stress, and that impacts a lot of the services that you're receiving as a constituent on the regular basis.
So what does the road ahead look like? Is there reason for hope?
Well, I don't want to say that hope is a lost cause, but honestly, it's rough out there. Last July's federal budget cut nearly $1 trillion in federal Medicaid spending over the next decade, and to make up the difference, states are tightening their belts everywhere. And Medicaid isn't obviously the only area that's affected. You've got education, transportation, infrastructure, they've all taken hits. So my takeaway here is that state governments, they're dealing with a tough set of constraints and some very hard choices. So the next time you're interacting with one of those state government workers, just know that they're doing the best they can with a pretty difficult hand.
All right. So, I wouldn't say that was exactly encouraging, but maybe there's a little hope in there. All right. Well, this segment was brought to you by Snowflake.
In a nutshell, Snowflake helps government agencies modernize the way they manage, share, and use data without forcing them to trade away control or operational speed. What we're bringing to the table is a platform that helps bring your data, your analytics, your code, and now your AI into a governed and scalable cloud environment. It matters because agencies are dealing with the same set of core problems. It's too many silos, it's too much data movement, it's too much operational complexity, and now I've got increasing pressure to support AI and cross-organizational collaboration. Snowflake is built to simplify that picture. Agencies can centralize governance, they can scale compute elastically and immediately, they can securely share data, and they can support more users and use cases without having to rebuild an architecture every time I'm scaling up or scaling down.
All right, this was our first in the loop, and we're learning as we go. So if you have any feedback, please let us know because we're here to make this a useful tool for you. So today's session, we want to thank our sponsors Okta, Ping Identity, Pluralsight, Carasoft, and Snowflake for supporting the inaugural edition of In the Loop. Thank you all so much for listening. We appreciate you. Go out and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks a lot.